Alright, so this is going to be the week that I get myself in a lot of trouble with the internet. And the reason I say this, of course, is I have decided on these two. Fifth Element and Big Trouble in Little China. The reason for this being that they're both these kind of fantasy action movies that, I, back in the day you could have said they garnered a cult following, but both these cults have grown so large I think you can just call them followings at this point. So, the problem here is that both of these have something else in common, too. And that is the fact that everybody I knew growing up seemed to really love these. And I didn't. I just really didn't at all. And it was always quite kind of baffling to me, actually. Like, The Fifth Element especially, like, everybody, like, so many people I went to school with talked about it there. All my brother's friends talked about it. Just a whole... It just seemed like the entire world was in love with this thing. To my understanding, the critics really took a liking to it. And I'm not quite sure how successful The Fifth Element was, like, box office-wise. I know Big Trouble in Little China definitely failed. And so that's kind of where the cult following thing came in, where people had to kind of track it down later. But it's also over a decade older than The Fifth Element, so it had kind of the running start on that whole status. But yeah, it was to my understanding that most everybody liked The Fifth Element. Like, one thing I even noticed was when Ricky Gervais was tearing everybody apart at the Golden Globes that first time, and the joke was he was going to rattle off Bruce Willis's filmography and then just introduce him as Ashton Kutcher's dad. But when he got to The Fifth Element in that list, you can see he, like, genuinely likes it. And it was like, good God, does everybody fucking love The Fifth Element but me, I guess? So, after my brother persuaded me, I went ahead and purchased it for $1 at the video store back here, and decided I'd give it another look. And I've watched it a couple of times since then, and that's relatively recent. So obviously we're going to start with The Fifth Element, of course. So yeah, I just really wasn't into it, and it took me a long time to get into sci-fi, I think, is the start of this. But, and as I've said many times before, I am really not the biggest Luc Besson fan, and this is a movie that definitely comes to mind when I would say that. I'm definitely more along the lines of his, like, his earlier kind of crime assassin movies like Leon and La Femme Nikita. That stuff I like. When he gets really, really big like this is where I get uncertain, and he gets a little ahead of himself. And obviously he's got a vast filmography. Like, before any of this was The Big Blue as well, which just totally sticks out except for the presence of Jean Reno, who I believe was supposed to be Corbin Dallas at the start before he... I guess before he realized he could actually get Bruce Willis, I guess. So, yeah, so I guess we start at the beginning. I think there's only so much that the intro needs to do, because there's so much explaining throughout. This is one of those movies where it's like, you can make a drinking game out of it, take a drink every time somebody says the title. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but they say it a lot. And it's like, well, I feel like they could have gotten us off to a much stronger start if they maybe had a stronger performer than Luke Perry. But he doesn't last very long, so it doesn't matter. And then once we immediately jump ahead to the future, it's kind of like the Kubrick thing, where we're in this, you know, time period from way back, and then suddenly we're in, like, the real future. Like, what is it, like 300 years or something? And so, I think, once we get here, I do kind of get it. It, like, from the start, just looking at it. When there's a huge, like, crowd, I guess, there's a huge appeal to a lot of people for worlds that seem to come from the bottom up. And yeah, you could say he took a lot of Blade Runner influence, but you can tell this is a lot more lively. Obviously Blade Runner was all, like, rainy and dark and stuff like that, and the Fifth Element's world is so vibrant and colorful, and does kind of stand out as its own thing. Like, honestly, I don't even really make Blade Runner comparisons when I watch it, unless somebody brings it up, and then it's like, yeah, I kind of get it. So I do get it immediately from that standpoint alone, why this appeals to people. So it's not like a totally baffling thing to me that this movie has such a fan base. But there is a lot more to it than that I'm sure people love. Starting with our central character, who I don't believe to be Corbin Dallas by any means. That, of course, is Leeloo, Milla Jovovich's character. And I can see this going both ways. I could see Leeloo just annoying the piss out of a viewer. I really can. But there's also... Number one, there's a whole commitment thing, because I had to look into it about the language. And apparently this was... Like, obviously Cameron got a lot of love for this when he made Avatar, but Luc Besson did it for this as well. He basically created a language for Leeloo to speak. And obviously Ian Holm in some scenes as well. And the thing about that is that Milla Jovovich has to not only learn this language and like speak it that he came up with, but she kind of mastered it and made it sound like some real ancient language or something. Like I think a lot of people just kind of assume that's what it is. And to think that he created it, and I guess like on the set, they can after a while they can actually talk to each other in it at least a little bit. Okay, that's a really impressive detail. It's like that almost goes beyond the term detail. And so I a huge credit to both of them, obviously more so Besson for creating it, but the fact that she was able to make it sound smooth enough to make it sound like she's speaking a legitimate language that only she understands is really impressive. But there's also something really... You could probably dismiss it as being like overly cutesy. I could really definitely see Leeloo being considered overly cutesy, but I do think it does help a lot in making her sympathetic, making you immediately sympathize for this character that we realize wasn't even human when we first met her. We see her created, but just immediately by the way she reacts to it, it's almost like she's a lost puppy or something. And you just kind of immediately have that. And that's important to feel sympathetic for her, mainly because you might get dismissive later when you think about the fact that, wow, random cab driver Corbin Dallas just suddenly threw himself into this. Alright. But that scene between them, when we can see him sympathizing for how lost she seems and how in danger she seems, honestly, it's in regards to just getting the movie moving, it's really not that much of a stretch to think, oh, well, he feels bad for her, and he thinks that she's cute, so he's gonna go along with this. Okay. And she makes that easy enough to believe, and we can get moving without the movie grinding to a halt with us questioning every possible thing. So that in itself works, and of course she brings about, there's a couple of iconic things in regards to this movie. Once again, iconic is a word that's thrown around a lot, but I really think Leeloo's, not just her hair, but the whole bandage getup, is something that is just instantly recognizable to so many people. I would like to think even some people who don't really know the movie that well would know it well enough to say, oh yeah, because of what I've heard, I know this is from The Fifth Element, just right off. And then the fugitive scene, to where it's like, this movie kind of takes a moment from another movie, but makes it iconic for its own movie. When basically, it's the scene from The Fugitive, when she's on the building and she jumps off while she's being pursued. And so, yeah, there is definitely plenty to admire here because of all this. However, I do think that for a movie that is so energetic and so lively, and feels like it's kind of moving a lot, I think, personally, that the pace is really off. Like, it's, like, it does seem like, you know, a lot is happening. And we have the whole, you know, opening scene. There's the opening scene with Luke Perry, but then there's the other opening scene when we are introduced to what's going to kill the Earth, basically. And it's only then that we're introduced to Leeloo, and then we're introduced to Corbin Dallas. In a sense, one of those might be out of order, but you get it. But it does seem like so much of this movie is intro. Do you realize it is 47 minutes in before we meet the villain? Before we even meet Gary Oldman, it is 47 minutes in. And even then, not only does it feel like the pacing is off, but it feels like the editing of it is all over the place. And not just like the editing of individual scenes or anything, but like the way the whole thing is put together. Because we are introduced... Well, let's actually go forward. This scene, when they introduce Zorg, and it's this really big moment where we get like the 3 zoom-ins on his building, we see his giant name across it, and he says Zorg and introduces himself, and it's this big triumphant thing. Only problem, this isn't his fucking intro. We met him like 3 scenes ago, and he had this whole thing where he introduced this weapon, and he blew the building up and all that. And it's like, it's disorienting, and it's like, okay, and that kind of fucks with you too, to where when you kind of feel like there should be a flow here, but shit like that is gonna make it seem like, well, okay, so we're just now being introduced to him, but wait a minute, we met him a while back. And when I say we are introduced to him 47 minutes in, that's when we first see him. And we kind of have this weird thing where it's cutting back and forth between him and Ian Holmes' apartment. And it all feels really jumbled and just really kind of fucks up this flow that it more or less kind of had. But then the movie ends up having this problem multiple times throughout. And feels, it's 2 hours and 5 minutes, which for a movie like this isn't that bad, but it feels long. Like, after a while it does. And also on that, there's also, every now and then you'll see, oh yeah, before we move on, I would like to say something else about Gary Oldman. It turns out, yeah, not everybody does like The Fifth Element. I only learned this, like, the other day, because I'm, like, binging Gary Oldman interviews because he's on the press run for Darkest Hour still, the awards run. And somebody finally asked him about Luc Besson, and The Fifth Element specifically, because obviously he had done Leon as well. And I had never learned this till this past week, that Gary Oldman kind of hates this movie. And I'm kind of not surprised. I believe his exact words were, "I can't bear it." But the reason that he did it was because he had done Leon, and then when he wrote and directed Nil by Mouth, Luc Besson helped him fund that movie. So he said, because you funded my movie, whatever you write next, I'll do it. And this is what it was. So he just did it, because he got to make Nil by Mouth, and Luc Besson helped him out with that. But, yeah. Okay, so me and Gary Oldman were kind of on the same page. I don't hate it at all. I don't think I ever really hated it. I just didn't really get what everybody was into. But, the more I watch it now, I'm starting to see something. So, yeah. So I guess if there's one person in the world that hates The Fifth Element, it's Gary Oldman. So take that for what you will. But going on, there's also, I talk about how it's really, really good looking, but naturally, I guess this kind of comes with the territory, there is some dated effects. And I know that's kind of hard to say, because I just talked about Cameron earlier with Avatar, but also, this was the same year that Titanic came out. So, we are in the land of effects can stand the test of time. The Fifth Element's likely won't, at least in a lot of cases. But that's not necessarily to say that it doesn't still kind of look good. Like, the chases, when they're flying around, like here, for instance. I don't know if you can see that. There you go. But, you can tell there's, like, it's just animated cars. But I don't know, there's still something well put together about these action scenes that still makes them exciting, even if they're starting to look a little fake. And honestly, a lot of people probably will end up finding that endearing, because it might give it the feel of, like, a B sci-fi movie. So, that actually might end up more or less working in its favor the more time goes on, the more dated it looks. As long as we don't get too well off in the future with those, I think it should be fine as long as it kind of keeps that kind of B sci-fi movie feel. That's not something people are really going to care about. And also, when you just look at the style in general, you can definitely tell that this is Besson's movie, especially when you look at his later work like Valerian. There's so much of this in Valerian, it's ridiculous. Like, I'm pretty sure they're set in the same universe. They might as well be, just with different names. But, and it actually does have, like, he does bring, like, a bit of a French feel to it. Like, there is, to use another French example would be that there are quite a few, like, it's not so much something I can pinpoint specifically, but there are some scenes or setups, or I guess just the aesthetic in general. You kind of get vibes of, like, Jean-Pierre Jeunet's movies. And that's an interesting thing to have. Like, that's an interesting kind of extra thing to have to this already kind of, you know, vibrant sci-fi movie, to kind of have those little touches in there that make it almost, like, give it kind of a European feel. Does make it very interesting and stand out in its own way. And it's like, I say what I do about Luc Besson, but I mean, to his credit, there aren't that many directors to where you can point out one of their movies immediately, like from miles away. But it's like if there were no names plastered on this movie, you could see it as well as many others and say this is such a Luc Besson movie. So yeah, obviously, I've probably been too hard on him in the past, even if his movies aren't always up to par. So remember, he did make Lucy, among many others that kind of fall down the wayside, especially recently. So, but there is definitely something special that he brings to this type of movie that I was kind of overlooking before, that I wasn't appreciating enough. And it's weirdly enough, I can't say enough about like the production design in this movie. Like not just, you know, the CGI landscapes or whatever, but there's also like the stuff inside, like the way the apartments are designed, the opera house, good god. The opera house is amazing. And this movie got one Oscar nomination, and it wasn't for production design, and that was baffling to me. Sound editing. Sound editing was its one nomination. And I suppose I get that, but I mean, the production design was a huge snub. But when you look at sound editing, one of the things that comes to mind, particularly talking about the Opera House, is the Giant Diva, which is another kind of really cool character in this that really does nothing else but this one song number, but she's like one of the more memorable images of the movie. This is like the regular DVD case, but like on the newer, more special edition, she like gets on the cover. And there's a lot of great things about this scene, but one in particular is the whole detail of, like, she actually could sing, but the thing is she determined that it was not humanly possible to change your voice the way that this song required, so they actually had to go in and individually have her sing the notes and then put them together. And so that gives it like a whole kind of exotic quality, this sound. So in cases like that where it gets really specific, I get it. But seriously, the production design was robbed. But then there's also stuff, and like that's the opera scene in general is fantastic. I do think it would. I know this is an action movie. I get it, but honestly, I do feel like this opera scene would have been much cooler and much more effective if the fight scene with Leeloo had come either before or after it, not necessarily in the middle of it, where we're cutting back and forth. I know the music, it kind of vibes with and all that, but I just really wish the opera scene kind of stood by itself without cutting to anything else, and that would have been a really cool kind of centerpiece to kind of take us into the final climax. But, well, one of two climaxes, or maybe even three, I don't know. But, yeah, so there is an awful lot of incoherence, excuse me. There's an awful lot of incoherence, definitely. But it's just so well put together in general, like in regards to like the passion for this. Obviously, I'm sure everybody knows by now that Luc Besson apparently wrote this when he was in high school, and you can tell. I mean, this is clearly the concoction of a teenager on the surface level, but once it goes on, it is one of those movies where I guess after a while it doesn't matter, because there's just so much to take in and so much to appreciate, regardless if sometimes it's all over the place, and it seems like maybe not a lot of it adds up. But there is one thing about this movie that tends to get criticism that I actually don't mind, and that well, okay, to an extent I don't mind, and that is Ruby Rhod. You can just tell. You can just tell when we see Ruby Rhod. It's like, this is going to be one of those characters that either everybody loves or everybody hates. There's going to be no middle ground. And it's apparently like Jamie Foxx was considered, which would have been very interesting. The thing I had always heard, I don't know if there's proof of this, but the thing I remember always hearing was that Besson wrote it with the idea that Prince would play Ruby Rhod, and that basically it came down to a scheduling conflict. That's what I've always heard. I don't know if there's any truth to that whatsoever, but yeah, so that in itself is very interesting, and you can kind of see those aspects in him for sure. But the thing about Ruby Rhod is that he's just this. We introduced him at the very beginning because they're talking about him on the TV in Corbin Dallas's apartment, but when he shows up in person in this whole introductory scene with him happens, once again, the incoherence at work, for sure. But it's just kind of so, it's such a surreal dose of adrenaline so suddenly when he appears that I actually kind of love it. Because this is the one thing in the movie where, because it came from out of nowhere, I actually really appreciate it. And yeah, and he so fits in with this world, but then so doesn't too. It's this weird thing. It's one of the rare inexplainable things in this movie that I actually don't mind, and I like it because of that. But I do understand if he can get tiresome, especially in the climax, when he's doing his high-pitched thing. Though this had to have come from out of fucking nowhere to a lot of people in 1997, because I think before this, all he had done was Friday and Dead Presidents. I don't remember where Money Talks was. It might have been somewhere in this area. So it's like, this was pre-Rush Hour. So this was the year before Rush Hour. So imagine if you looked at, Jackie Brown was this year too. So it was a very interesting place. It kind of makes you realize, I wonder what Chris Tucker's career would have been like without Rush Hour. Like, what other kind of random interesting shit could he have done? He was Ruby Rhod in The Fifth Element, and he was in a Tarantino movie in the same year. And then Rush Hour just kind of took him in one direction. But it's like, this makes me curious what his career would have been, I guess, without Brett Ratner. Because Money Talks was kind of the same thing, too. So, yeah, but yeah, they do. You can see those Prince qualities in him too, to where it's like you immediately see him and you immediately get one vibe. Like, he's very flamboyant and feminine, but then at the same time he can't resist himself around women. Not the other way around. He can't resist himself. It's like, I can only imagine if Ruby Rhod was a celebrity today, and what this movement would do to that's just a fun thing to think about. It's like, I'm sorry, ladies, but if Ruby Rhod exists in the future, you good luck while it lasts. And yeah, another great thing about the movie is its sense of humor. Like, sometimes, there are movies where the sense of humor gets to be a bit too much, to where it's like they almost want to make a comedy, and when maybe they should just kind of play it more straight. But yeah, this movie does kind of use its sense of humor in a good way. One of my particular favorite scenes is when he's hiding everybody in his apartment, and everything is... He's always hiding them in the wrong places. He almost fucking suffocates Ian Holm. It's hilarious, but, and yeah, throughout you can see those, details. They throw in those futuristic details. One obvious one is the way the cigarettes are designed. So yeah, it's full with all that stuff. We also have a lot of cameos. Well, if you can call them that. Like, just random appearances, really, like Lee Evans. just in a random place. And then, there's a lot of debate about who Finger is. The guy that Willis is talking to on the phone at the beginning, that he keeps saying is going to kill him. Determination seems to think that it is Vin Diesel. Like, apparently that's the main belief, though it could be a number of people. I don't know if there's any confirmation on that either. But yeah, it does sound like it. So, once again, that's weird. I don't think I've ever know for sure if that's been proven or not. But yeah, when you look through this also, there are little things you might notice after a couple times seeing it, and something that has really become popular when talking about this movie, it's not something you have to look for anymore, is the fact that this is one of those interesting movies where our hero and our villain never meet. Corbin Dallas and Zorg never have a scene together. I would think that's cool, honestly, I would. But the problem here is that after a while, not only are we introduced to him so late, but by the time we get to the climax, Zorg feels like an afterthought. It feels like he hardly did a whole lot of anything, really. I mean, Oldman's performance makes an impression. Good or bad, it makes an impression. But Zorg does feel incredibly underused, to the point that that's never really... Like, once I did realize that, it was kind of like, oh, that's cool, but then after, like, 10 seconds, it's like, but I kind of see how that happened, because... And either one is barely focused. Corbin Dallas himself is, like... Okay, so we introduce him in his apartment, and then he's out driving, and he meets Leeloo. He takes Leeloo to Ian Holm. And then it's like an hour into the movie before he's relevant again. And that's just another one of those cases where it's like, it's just everywhere, this movie. And I honestly, it's one of those cases where you just have to pick and choose what you're going to embrace. And most people just embrace the whole thing. And that's great. And there are certainly things here and there that I can go along with for sure. But these other things where it's kind of like, I feel like there's a lot that can be cut. There really is. Like, this movie can definitely be cut down to maybe an hour 40 something. Would feel a lot smoother. Characters would feel more like they're in the same damn movie. And... But yeah, like, and then there's cases like Ruby Rod where I just say, fuck it, do your thing. So that's, yeah, it really just depends. It's definitely one of those movies that's a prime example of, when you look at, like, this whole story and you see all the talking and all the exposition, it's kind of like, this is definitely an example of one of those movies to where it's like, this is a prime example of overcomplication. Like, complication in general does not necessarily equal smart, per se. Like, when you think the word complex, you immediately think, oh, a movie that's really well thought out, and it's like, kind of, it takes like a mature viewer to be able to piece everything together and catch everything and all that. And it's like, no, there are definitely movies that can make themselves dumber the more they complicate themselves. And yeah, you could say it's an endearing kind of dumb. I think a lot of people do. Even if they love the movie, they can kind of acknowledge that, but that's like the appeal to it. And yeah, for me that only goes so far, as you'll learn soon. But yeah, overall, I am starting to kind of grow. The Fifth Element is starting to grow on me. I do think one major problem is that by the time we get to the climax, like the final climax, where we're literally saving the world, at this point, by the time you actually get to the point where you're saving the world, like, up to this point, it's like gun battles with, like, monsters and shit. In really cool opera houses, mind you, but still. But then by the time we actually get to the point where we're saving the world, I am so worn out on this movie. It's like, I rarely am ever, like, really into this movie by the time the world is being saved, because it feels like we've had a couple of climaxes up to that point before we have the big one. Obviously, useless as Zorg is already blown up by this point, further proving his lack of relevance in this story. So, yeah, but once again, though, the action can get pretty spectacular. It's always creative. I think one critic called it a visual candy store. That's a pretty good way to put it. And, yeah, and you can see, you know, influence, not just Besson influencing himself later, but in movies like Guardians of the Galaxy, the second one even more so, you can see a lot of influence to where it's kind of like, it kind of took a bit of, maybe this is just my opinion against Blade Runner, but it's like, I understand if, like, where a lot of people would say, oh, all these movies are Blade Runner influenced, I could also see them being Fifth Element influenced as well. So, it has definitely made its place, for sure, which I will commend it for, and like I said, I will see it more times down the road. We'll see how much more it grows on me. Maybe I'll be into the climax one of these days, but overall, yeah, obviously I'm mixed, but I'm getting there. And this is where I think the internet's going to really get pissed off. Normally I wouldn't give the slightest flying fuck what people on the internet even say, but given the fact that this is going to be on YouTube, I technically am part of that, so I'm, like, in the internet as I say this, so it's a tiny bit of a concern that I am amongst them as I talk about my opinion on Big Trouble in Little China. A movie that so many people love. I mean, I knew growing up that people liked it, but I mean, as it goes on, I mean, it's a little, in my eyes, it's a little ridiculous just how beloved this movie is. But I'm not gonna say, you know, I'm not gonna say fuck you for thinking that or anything like that. Like, there are essays on this movie out there. There are, like, essay level, like, you know, endearing reviews of this movie. Most of them are not very well written and are quite childish. Like, most of it just boils down to, I had fun watching it. Which, okay, that is great. That's its intention, for sure. And I can't dismiss that because it's not just like they're picking out a movie and just saying, oh, it's fun, so it's the greatest thing ever. No, people are really passionate. They're like really legitimately passionate when they talk about how much they love this movie. And I am not there. I am not even close. And I would like to try to explain why. Because even like, it's not even one of those movies I grew out of. When I saw it as a kid, I was saying, this is so fucking dumb. Like, to the point that I am not into it. Like, not like, oh, it's so dumb, it's endearing. No, I'm just not into it at all. So, we start off, and I do get it, okay? I do get the whole... There are a few cases where it likes to really subvert cliches. The biggest point being the fact that it's an action movie told from the perspective that's not the hero. Like, we got the surely intentional casting of Kurt Russell here, like, ultimate action hero Kurt Russell. And we realize very quickly that he's barely the star of this movie. I mean, he's the star of the movie, but not the story, if you know what I mean. Obviously, his friend Wang is, like, our kind of action hero here. He's the one that's wiping out dudes left and right, and Jack Burton is the bumbling sidekick. So yes, in concept, that is clever. And so, as it goes, and yeah, and they do play him up throughout the entire movie, as this complete and total bumbling idiot. Take, for instance, the scene where he has to infiltrate this, massage-type place, looking specifically for this girl that's just been taken. And of course we know that, the whole green eyes are a very rare thing, and that's why she stands out. That's how they identified her, or thought they were identifying her. And they've just taken her in. So Jack Burton, the genius, walks in disguise, his dorky disguise, and we think, oh yeah, he's the hero, he's gonna be real smooth. And he's like, yeah, I'm looking for a girl with green eyes, fresh off the boat. Oh yeah, way to make yourself fucking conspicuous, Jack Burton. So yeah, the whole movie basically plays on the fact that he's an idiot. It's like a one joke. It's like this character is one joke through the whole movie. I think that's kind of where the subverting the cliche falls apart a little bit, where it's like, yeah, I get that. And then the movie just kind of keeps going. And I understand that that can be commended, that the movie keeps up with it the whole time. But then it's kind of like, yeah, but there's 99 minutes of this. It's gonna wear thin. Like, that's just going to happen. So, as it goes on, there's a number of things that just make me really have trouble kind of getting into it from the get-go. Like, think of it this way. This movie is so incredibly ridiculous throughout. I mean, we've got sorcery, we've got wizardry, it's like this old-fashioned kind of kung fu movie. It's got all this stuff going on. It is so preposterous from the get-go, and hopes that we will embrace that. With that said, there is some stuff, kind of like when they go to the airport at the very beginning, and we see Kim Cattrall for the first time. I wish it was the last, but it's not. And so, when we see her, Burton, of course, is immediately taken by her. And he's like, oh, who's that? And and his friend is like, oh, no, that's trouble. Stay away from her. And it's like, I'm sitting here thinking, well, what a coincidence. It's like, oh, who's that girl I just happened to lay my eye on? Oh, in this crowded airport, I just happen to know who that is and can tell you that she's trouble. And it's like, with everything that goes on in this movie, why do I give a fuck about that? Why do I give a fuck about a coincidence in a movie that has all this other shit in it? Well, that's the thing, is we get to this point, and they're so casual about it. They play this up like it's such a normal thing that it just really highlights a clumsiness to it from the get-go, before action is even broken out. And that's kind of, not to say that's like the main starting point of, oh, well, I'm not going to like this. But it's definitely a telling sign. It's a symptom of what's to come for me and how I'm going to view this movie. And so, as it goes on, we eventually meet our villain. And this is another big problem that I have with the movie, is, I'm sorry, but Lo Pan is such a fucking lame villain. And the thing about that is, there are things that completely try their hardest to go against that. He's one of those villains that is, like, constantly being built up, and it's like, oh, he's so evil, he's, like, the most evil sorcerer ever, he's capable of this, he's capable of this. And it's like, we're being constantly told how evil he is and how powerful he is, but we like hardly get any looks at it at all, to the point that they build it up so much that every single time he's on screen it is so fucking underwhelming. The openings, the first time we see him, this is another one of those things to where even as a kid I was saying, is this for real? In a bad way. The very first time we see Lo Pan, he gets fucking plowed over by Burton's truck. Now once again, then maybe we're subverting cliches. Maybe it's like, oh, that's funny because he's the big bad villain. Very first time we see him, he gets run over by a truck. And Burton brings this up continuously throughout the entire movie. But the thing about that is, that's just the start of it, though. Because the thing here is that, there's the whole thing about changing his form. This is lost on me. And from what I read up on, basically it's supposed to be one of the assets of the movie. That they don't explain anything and it does whatever the fuck it wants. Like the more confused you are, the more fun you're having, supposedly. But it's like the way Lo Pan can just change forms. Like one minute he's evil sorcerer dude, and then the next he's decrepit old guy who like needs to break a curse. Despite the fact that he can continuously go back and forth. Maybe I missed something in the constant explaining they do, but if they had made those scenes a little more interesting too, maybe I would... But the problem is that, not just that, but most of the movie is quite unmemorable to me. So none of this is really coming together in a bit of a fun way, even. And so it goes on also, and honestly, and maybe this is a little petty, but there's something else that just really, really bothered me about Lo Pan as a villain. And that is the fact that his name is David Lo Pan. For starters, he's supposed to be, what, 2,200 and something years old? Or he was like around and kicking 2,200 years ago. So God knows how old he actually is. Alright, and he's this big bad sorcerer wizard villain named David. And it's like, once again, I get that the movie's kind of supposed to be silly, but I mean, okay, so on top of the whole, he's just lame in general to begin with. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. But the thing here is that I talk about The Man from Laramie, the Anthony Mann Western with James Stewart, which is amazing. And one of the things that always cracked me up about that movie was that the big bad villain is named Dave. And even when Jimmy Stewart's like screaming Dave as he's going at him, you just can't take it seriously. And then there is the Penguins of Madagascar movie made a whole joke about this by naming the big bad octopus villain played by John Malkovich Dave. Like, that was the joke. And I don't know if the point is that everybody's playing this seriously or not. But no, I think he just has a stupid fucking name, end of story. Has nothing to do with the campiness of the movie at all. But you probably think I'm dwelling on this, so I'll move on. But actually, one more thing. And apparently he's a big deal, though. And the one thing that really stood out to me was, of all things, like, just of the most random of things, the Ultimate Showdown song. Do you remember that? The Mr. Rogers in a Bloodstained Sweater thing? When they're going through all the different people in this showdown, we've got, like, Abraham Lincoln and Batman and all that stuff, like Indiana Jones and all that. And then there's this portion in the middle where he's just rattling names off of all these big characters that are come out and fight each other. Everything down to Johnny the Genie from Pee-wee's Playhouse. And it's like, okay. But then he gets to the middle and he's listing all these characters and he says, Captain Kirk, Darth Vader, Lo Pan, Superman. And when I remember when I first heard that song, I had to stop and say, wait a fucking minute. Lo Pan? The weak-ass villain from Big Trouble in Little China? People fucking remember that guy? That he's lined up among these names? I know the song is random as hell, so it's not like they're saying he's as popular as those, but it's like, that really stood out to me because it's just so baffling to me to think that this character is memorable enough to make it into that song at all. It's weird to me. But going in also, yes, this is one of those movies where it gets, I love that people are passionate about it, okay? I love when people are passionate about any movie, even if it's terrible, because, if anything, I'm envious. But the thing is it's like, this is one of those movies where I can only imagine trying to argue a criticism would just really fucking piss me off, because it's one of those movies that some people might think is exempt from criticism because it's tongue-in-cheek. That in itself excuses it from all the stupid shit. And the problem here is that I recognize those tongue-in-cheek things. I know this is strictly a subjective thing, so this isn't even hardly, some criticism that's going to suddenly change people's minds or anything. Just from my personal perspective, the problem is that the movie is not funny. When I understand exactly the points where we're kind of supposed to get that vibe. But no, they can do, like, every now and then, there's a scene that'll get me. Like, I do like the moment when they're in the elevator before the final showdown, and Ryan just kind of gets really confident. He's like, I just have a really good feeling about this. Like, I feel really confident right now. And they all just kind of agree. It's like little moments like that are funny, but I mean, they're like so few and far between. When basically, like the whole Jack Burton being an idiot thing is like an entire joke throughout the movie that is clever, but never really that funny. It's just, you go with it. He's an idiot. And that's the end of it. And I never... No. And that's not helped at all by the fucking awful Kim Cattrall. She is just absolutely my least favorite thing in this movie. And the thing about it was, to my understanding, that Carpenter and the writers, their idea was basically to make them like Howard Hawks characters. Like Cary Grant and Hepburn in Bring Up Baby, or Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell in His Girl Friday. And it's like, wow, that's embarrassing when you look at how this turned out. Because not only is it just an awful performance, and she's also, like, you can even tell she's supposed to be kind of tongue-in-cheek too, like when she comes into the room and she says, "It's only me, Gracie Law," and you can tell that's supposed to be like some kind of, comical parody thing to that type of character or something, but it fails because it's not fucking funny. It's annoying because she's so terrible. And her deliveries are so fucking off, to where it's like, I think she realizes, it's almost like okay, to her credit, she kind of seemed like she was looking for the place she should have been, which was the fine line between knowing it's parody and also trying to play it serious. But it turned into this horrible concoction on its way there, trying to figure this out. And it's this horrible mixture of both, like, it's a bad version of both of those. So it's like, as comedy it sucks, and trying to play it straight it sucks. And then, like I said, we're supposed to find her and Burton's back and forth banter, like Howard Hawks levels of dialogue. And it's like, for starters, they barely share any fucking scenes together. And every single time they do try to do the flirtatious thing, the sexual tension thing, it is so forced, but I've never seen something so forced, so equally non-existent. There's nothing there. If there's any relief in this movie, it's the fact that he says, "No, we're not kissing, I'm leaving." That's the best thing that character could have done to this rapport. So, it's just a terrible character all the way through. And to my understanding, I would really like to know the early versions of this script, because apparently it was supposed to be a Western with all this, supernatural action thrown into it. It's going to be set in, like, the Old West, and it's like, apparently they thought it didn't mesh very well. It probably would have been something kind of like Westworld. This was, 13 years after Westworld. So they could have maybe kind of tried to do something like that again. But the thing here is that apparently they brought in a script doctor who thought that the script was absolutely awful. So he was like, "We're going to redo it entirely. The only thing we're going to keep is Lopan's story." Brilliant. So they completely restructured this, and he said, his exact words, I believe, were, "It's a dreadful script. That's why I'm changing everything." But it's like, okay, so if he took a dreadful script and wrote this in place of it, I really want to know what that other script looked like. And it's almost the case where it's kind of like, well, if the guy who wrote this thought that script was awful, maybe it wasn't. It's like, I don't know, I would trust the guy that wrote this to say what's good and what isn't. So, yeah. But apparently a lot of people would, because a lot of people love this movie. So, that's just me, okay? It's just me. And the problem, too, is that the whole fun aspect people are talking about here, I don't get that either, because I think the action's really boring. Because a lot of the times it's not even, it's almost like, okay, like there's the scene when the dude is just, you know, throwing his swords about in a threatening way, which is its own scene. Okay. There's the henchman that like is constantly just doing this until he literally blows himself up. So there's that. But then there are these fighting scenes where you think, okay, this will be like the high point, right? I mean, I know it's supposed to be cheesy and like, you know, old kung fu movies and all that were like really poorly put together anyway. But I mean, there's really hardly any excitement here because it's kind of like every action, like there's an action and then there's a cut before the reaction, and that's pretty much what the whole scenes look like. And that's the problem, is that you may be trying to recreate what these B kung fu movies were doing, but those weren't exciting either because they looked like this. That's the problem. And just recreating it and saying, well, it's like that old thing. See, we're doing that old thing here. It's a callback. But it's the quality has not changed on its way here. That's the problem. Regardless of if you're doing a tongue-in-cheek thing, it doesn't matter, because it still looks like the same thing during the fight scenes. Yeah, you'll occasionally throw in, oof, Jack Burton to, you know, shoot at people, but it's like, oh, well, that doesn't make him any more of an ass-kicker, because Wang can just do it with his, you know, legs and fists and all that. And that's the thing, too, is it's kind of like, when I say they're explaining way too much shit all the time, which really drags the movie down a lot. Where it's like, they're always like, it's almost like they're trying to look for ways to change the rules every time they have a new stretch of dialogue, to where it's like, here's what you must understand to know all this stuff. And then we get that vibe as it goes on, but then it's like, oh, here's a whole new batch of bullshit. Now we have all this shit going on. And it's like this continuous thing throughout. But then we get, finally, towards the end, this is where it gets confusing. This is when the line really blurs. Because Jack Burton pipes in and says, what are we sitting around here talking about ancient Chinese history for, when there's action to be had? And it's like, this is where I fail to see which side we're supposed to be on, because, yeah, Jack Burton could be the audience at this point. When he says, like, okay, enough exposition, let's get to the ass-kicking. And the audience will be like, yeah, fuck yeah, let's do that. And it's like, yeah, he's like a surrogate for the audience when he talks like that. But then you look back and you realize throughout the whole movie, Jack Burton is supposed to be the brainless oaf. So it's like, is he ignoring history because he's the audience, or because he's a brainless oaf? And it's like, you're getting a little too close to calling your audience. You know, maybe some people might think that's not the case at all, and I'm reaching a little bit in regards to what their intentions were with this one line. But I mean, that's honestly, I think it starts to blur the line to where it's kind of like, okay, so what are you doing now? I know you're wanting to do the tongue-in-cheek thing the whole time, but where does it start and where does it stop? And it is important where that line is. I know of a movie this outrageous that's like constantly trying to be parody, you just kind of let it do its thing. But yeah, it is important to make sure that the movie is not crossing any certain lines to kind of almost being something else, almost becoming what it's parodying before it goes back to that. And this is when it starts to kind of, yeah, it gets very. I know people are gonna say like where most people see it as like outlandish, which is basically a positive way of saying it's all over the damn place, or saying that it's basically intentionally nonsensical and that you just have to decide to go with it. I honestly just see it as dumb and not the endearing dumb. It's like every time a new scene comes in, it's just like, I just feel like it almost gets dumber as it goes. And there's just, and once again, I guess it all just depends on from the get-go where you are. And it does not grab me from the get-go, so it sure as shit doesn't have me throughout. And it's a shame, because I'm not here to bash it and put everybody down for liking it. I know that's probably how a lot of people will take it. They've probably stopped watching at this point. But the thing here is, it's really shitty to tell somebody that it's really shitty to say somebody's wrong for liking a movie, you know? So that's not what I'm here to do. I am saying it baffles me. It absolutely positively baffles me, the audience that this movie has. But it happens. So And just like I think it's a little shitty to tell somebody they're wrong for liking it, which I wouldn't do, I'd also like to think you'll return me the courtesy of it being the other way around too. And I'm not necessarily wrong because I don't like it. So, and I mean, I imagine a lot of the fans, I would think they understand. They would understand somebody not liking this. They would have to. It's certainly not something that's like this objectively masterful thing. I'm sure there's at least a couple out there that would argue, but yeah, that's the thing, is we're just totally coming from different places, and I'm not at all trying to bring down the people that love it and put it on this massive pedestal for whatever reason that I will never understand. So there's that, but it's like, when Burton is leaving at the end, he's leaving Kim Cattrall behind, and he says, the reason for that is, sooner or later I rub people the wrong way. And it's like, well, for me, it was sooner. So, so clearly, I'm on the Fifth Element side here, where it's no longer baffling to me why this would have the crowd that it does, even if I'm not quite on the same page with it. It's just lost on me. I don't... It's just... I wish I could see it the way people do. But when I see and read people talking about how much they love the movie, it's like I said, I get envious, because it's like, I would love to see this movie this way. Because surely, if you've seen enough of my stuff, you know, I love being able to embrace movies like this that just go completely off the rails and maybe make no sense. But if they're exciting and funny and all that, and know what they're doing, then I can really, really get swept up in it. But no, this movie just stops me right at the fucking door, and I just don't see it at all. So, sorry. In the meantime, I do know what the next 3 or so verses are going to be, so that should be fun. Basan will be coming back in a few weeks. But in the meantime, I'd like to see if you'll notice, starting with last week with Blood Simple and Dial M for Murder, I'm doing a bit of a trend in these next few, so I wonder if you can catch that or not. Probably not. Yeah, but in the meantime, we also have reviews coming. Obviously, I'm really late this week. I'm doing that Hostiles video after I'm shooting that right as soon as I turn the camera off. I'm going to turn it right back on and do the Hostiles review. So, I'm not sure when these will go out, but you'll see them at some point, I'm sure. And regardless of whether or not you're angry, I guess I'll find out. So, or Owen will find out and tell me. So, so yeah, for now, I think we're done here.